Hello friends, Steve here. I am going to admit I am a bit bored of interviewing people, so for this very special episode I've asked the incredible science communicator Sam McKay to interview a scientist who does not exist. Now, few clarifications. This scientist doesn't exist and is not based on anybody alive or dead. Rather embarrassingly, after we recorded it, I did Google the scientist and found out that there are a whole bunch of living scientists who share this name. It's a very common name. This person is not based on any of them, and I think once you find out a bit about their biography, you'll understand that this is in no way a parody of anybody. It is in fact a parody of everybody. I've said enough. Enjoy.
Self-indulgence. Conceptual mindfuckery. If no one knows and no one cares, that's the only way you can get away with anything in this world.
Hello and welcome to A Life Full of Science. I'm Sam McKay, and today I have the privilege of being joined by Professor Sir Roger Benson, the most famous living 20th century scientist, in his first media appearance since the mysterious disappearance of his wife 3 months ago on the Zambezi River. Hello, Roger, and welcome to Wow, What a Life Full of Science.
Hello, Sam. I mean, it's such a joy to be able to tell these stories all over again, you know. Interesting you bring up the wife, of course. Amelia herself was a very talented researcher, and as far as we know, she's still out in the Zambezi looking for the lesser striped blue piranha, which was long considered extinct, but one turned up in a museum in Hartlepool earlier this year. So she's out there looking for them. I mean, we'll probably see her in about 9 months or so, I would have thought.
One can absolutely hope, but the point of today's discussion isn't about Amelia. It's about you and your science as we begin the process of chronicling your entire life's work, from your first rendezvous with Watson and Crick to, well, we'll get there. Surely the best place to start in this discussion would be where it all began, your schooling in, none other than Hartlepool itself.
I mean, school, what people have to remember who are listening, young people like you, Sam, is you don't realize school was very different then. I mean, these days, there's GCSE level, you can do 3 separate sciences or dual award, combine them together. But in my day, we hadn't quite firmed up exactly what the sciences were. So at GCSE, I actually did 7 sciences, including astrology and phrenology. It was only a few years later that we realized these weren't sciences at all, and they were struck off, and we got down to the current kind of biology, chemistry, physics, geology.
Which leads us to a very interesting talking point there. Actually, your work in helping decide what science is. Because as you say, there were a multitude of sciences. In fact, over 2 dozen to choose from. You selected 7. Your work alongside Fisher and Watson, actually, to decide what a science is, what science as a whole is, and how did that come about? How did that first chance meeting with those 2 monoliths of science start?
I mean, they were very different days. We were all working in Cambridge at the time. There was only one public house in the entire city. So it was inevitable that we'd all meet up on a regular basis. You know, just a pub full of young scientists making their way in the world. It was a wonderful, wonderful feeling. I mean, I should say the hardest thing about this kind of delineation of a hard science from a nonsense was that we needed an objective way to do it. You know, you can't choose what is objective in a way that is not in itself objective. And, Fisher, he just wanted to lay out the different subjects in the form of fish guts and then release an Arctic skewer, and whichever ones it ate must be the real sciences. And Watson, he just wanted to write a racist diatribe using each of the knowledge of the sciences, and whichever one sold the most, he would have declared as sciences. But I I managed to talk them both out of this sort of nonsense. And what we did in the end was we crystallized each science as a perfect single crystal. And then we fired a beam of neutrons at them. And the ones that absorbed the neutrons we knew were real sciences. So we used this objective measure to decide what were the areas of objective measure, as it were. I'm very proud of it to this day.
And of course, you were snubbed for that year's Nobel Prize for Science. But back to the most important part of this. We're chronicling your life.
It was Kinsey, you know. It's the problem. Sex sells. It's always likely to get a Nobel Prize ahead of that sort of, theoretical boundary work.
But, well, which often doesn't necessarily... the crossover between science and sex is less frequent than we might perhaps...
Well, you say that again, but young Sam, this is a thing that's really changed about science these days. If I take you back to the pub in Cambridge, the Cambridge it was called, Fisher, Watson, me, all of the scientists there, people, when they look back, they think of us and they think about our minds and they think about our achievements and our medals. But at the time, we really just thought of ourselves as a bunch of extremely attractive people trying to get into each other's pants using equations.
And we can get to your successes there at very shortly. But right now, what I want to go back to...
Let me stop you for a moment, Sam.
Apologies.
I realise this whole project is about the Royal Society capturing as much of me as it can before I, shuffle off. But I'm not Watson. I'm not going to sit here and list all of my various conquests. A gentleman doesn't kiss and tell, and I'll draw your attention to the letters after my name. I am legally a gentleman.
Okay. Those being FFS.
Yes, Fellow of the Fellowship Society.
Yes. And that's, of course, why you're here. So, 7 sciences. We have 3 sciences eventually, but at this point in time, we have 7 sciences. And you finish your GCSEs. Where do you go next?
It was difficult in those days because, you've got to choose where to study. But the criteria are very different than they are now, These days, you just look at where your parents or their friends' parents went to university and studied science, and you study the same science in the same place. Whereas in my day, our parents didn't study science. They were too busy tending to the huge estates they'd inherited down their family line since the Norman conquest. So it was quite a change. So, obviously, at the time, because I'm an older man than you, at the time there were only 2 universities. So it was easy to choose with the 2 universities of University of Cambridge, which I attended, and University of Hull. So I chose Cambridge.
Although later in your life you would take a brief sabbatical at Hull. So you study at Cambridge.
It's the best if you're looking for, as I was, the effects of quantum stagnosis on fish schools. It really is the best. The access to the North Sea is absolutely wonderful in terms of the arrays we were installing. I have a lot of time for them.
Not quite so nice for swimming, though, if you don't mind. So, fish. But you don't start on fish. You head to Cambridge and immediately you fall in love with the green-tailed frog-mouthed crab. How does a scientist go from the green-tailed frog-mouthed crab to quantum entanglement of fish schools?
Well, I think the key thing throughout my career has been the neutron. You remember the neutron was how we decided what was a real science, and it was my fascination with the neutron that first led me to the frogs. Because I don't know if you know this, it's a little known fact. I wrote a paper about it in 1958. It's not been very well cited. Those frogs are the single largest sources of neutrons on the planet's surface. Obviously, astronomically, there's something about these frogs, but just neutrons pour off them in all sorts of directions. Fisher thought it was some kind of defensive mechanism. He died unfortunately, before he could do the maths to prove that. And so it's the neutrons pouring off these things. And we thought to ourselves, what happens if you bring two together? Because traditionally these frogs stay apart from during the moment of coupling, where the neutrons are turned off temporarily by the pleasure. What happens if we bring them together and we let these neutron fields interfere? And that's what led us to the quantum arrays.
Okay. And just for those people out there who aren't necessarily aware, what is a neutron?
Very slippery customer, your neutron. Very slippery. Known throughout the physics world. At the most fundamental level, neutrons are part of the fundamental building blocks of everything. Think about the table in front of you. Quite a lot of that is neutrons. The glass of brandy in your hand, just a neutron central. But normally these neutrons are very held. They're bound together with other things. Bound like a 1987 Yellow Pages for the South Cambridgeshire region, really bound together strongly. But it's the cases where the neutrons go free that I think interested us. I mean, obviously, you've heard of the neutron bomb, something I've tried to avoid exposing myself to. But it's these strange cases of the slippery. Still, I feel I never quite got my hands on him, the slippery neutron.
But you did later manage to get your hands on a new kind of particle, the new neutron, just after you finished your studies on the green-tailed frogmouth crabs. In that brief gap between heading off to study fish schooling, the new neutron, where did it come from? What is it? How did you study it? What did you find out?
I mean, really, the new neutron, it grew out of just people becoming very bored with the old neutron. Just the same old experiments over and over again. So what we needed was to create something with a new twist, to re-energize the funders and the supporters and get government money pouring back into neutron work. The new neutron was our attempt to do that. So we took existing neutrons, we reverse polarized them through the spectroaccelerometer. We added a twist of lime. Voila, new neutrons, a whole new set of atomic chemistry to explore.
Where was I?
I mean, it feels slightly morbid to be sitting here dictating the not quite my crap last tapes. The sort of thing that I mean. Counting down the moments to one's own demise in anecdotes.
And in doing so, providing your family with a comfortable life for the foreseeable future. As, of course, we know very well, academia doesn't pay like it used to.
Well, you say that, but there have been times in my life where I've been lucky to be just fortuitously rich. I remember the discovery of green lasers. That kept me going for a while through the disco boom. The late 70s and early 80s made an absolute killing off that. But Sam, it was a different world. And one of the challenges I've had throughout my entire career has been my crippling addiction to online tarot readings. I mean, sometimes I think that when you spend all of your days deep in the most objective, logical, rationalist thinking, it creates a hole in the center of you, and the hole can only be filled by paying spiritualists around the world to read cards and answer your deeper philosophical questions.
So, do you think that there is a place in our world for both science and spirituality?
Absolutely. I'm not one of those, those people, the scientists who say we've squeezed God out, we've squeezed the spirit out. I've always considered myself a non-believing but occasionally practicing member of numerous religions and spiritualities and beliefs, because you have to remember we were going through a time of an explosion of scientific ideas brought about by the cross-pollination of biology and physics for the first time. And I took one look and I thought, if these two combined lead to this explosion, what if we combined 30 ways of thinking, 28 of them spiritual, with physics, biology? And that was what led to so many of the discoveries. The first time, I mean, you'll remember in 61, I won the Royal Academy of Engineering Prize for proving that energy could be usefully extracted from ghosts, but only along the south coast of England.
Which, of course, only further aided the north-south divide in the United Kingdom, providing a limitless energy supply to the south, while the north was sadly left out of the equation.
Sometimes I feel bad for the people of Hartlepool. I didn't spend more time working out whether there was a 0 point energy involved in some nice hills. But maybe this is a challenge. Maybe this is a challenge you could take up, young Sam. Something for younger scientific minds to find the ghosts, not ghosts, but the ghosts equivalents of the North.
And studies are continuing to explore the potential there for the generation of energy. But so where had we got to? We'd headed up to Hull. After you finished your sabbatical in Hull, you took a brief momentary break to travel the world and explore the science of other cultures. You went over to, most notably, the deepest, darkest heart of Africa, a place which you eventually fell in love with. What was it particularly about Africa that really grasped you?
Human sacrifice.
The process of? Or...
You know that science in the UK it takes place in a very rigid ethical framework, and sometimes some of us who have really explored the more esoteric edges, we need to go somewhere else to find a less of a straitjacket holding us in place. And that 18 months I spent working with a warlord in the south of Sierra Leone, it really gave me an opportunity to just really check out some of the hypotheses that had been in my mind for a long time. It turned out none of them were true. None of them worked at all. There's no scientific merit to any of the things that we did. It's one of the reasons why nothing's been published. It's very hard to get Nature to run a paper entitled "I Ate a Human Heart," and it had no scientific merit whatsoever. But it was good to get them ticked off. You know, scientists, so many questions come to us during our lives, and our job is to resolve those questions, or to see if they turn into another 20 questions, each of which we can get funded by a different government body. And sometimes the questions linger, and you have to work your way through them. So I would say a lot of negative data, but not a lot of time wasted.
So your fleeting 18-month relationship with the warlords of Sierra Leone was recapitulated further down the line, and during your first exploration of the Zambezi River, after you'd heard the potential that there might be some blue piranha still swimming about.
I mean, it's much more Amelia's area, this one. I mean, if you could wait 9 months, you could interview her. But, as you know, I did go along for the first 6 weeks. But it was only because, I don't know if you know, Sam, but my wife is absolutely fantastic in bed. And I just thought, before you hide yourself away in the Amazon basin for a year, it would just be nice to just again work through some ideas that have come to me. So it was a lovely few weeks. During the day, I'd sit on the deck of the boat that was exploring the Amazon, occasionally sipping a mint julep, and then evenings just a wild experimental debauchery, bringing together all of my spiritual learning, my scientific learning, I tell you. If you know a lot about physics and biology, there are places you can go.
The intersection of all things, biomechanics, which is what you did as soon as you got back to the UK after this brief tryst exploring the world. So, you've been to Cambridge, you've been to Hull, you finally go and settle in Swainpool. Why Swainpool? What was it about Swainpool that helped you come up with what would become some of your most famous scientific ideas?
Well, one thing you might not know is that in the world of biomechanics, funding is very hard to come by. And the number one funders of biomechanics work are racehorse owners, interested in the gait of the racehorse, the arrangement of the jockey on the racehorse. And Swainpool, I mean, it's an incredible place because it's the only place in the entire world where the native foxes have spontaneously learned to ride horses. And so specifically, we were measuring the biomechanical effect of having a horizontal four-legged rider instead of a vertical two-legged rider. And obviously, the foxes themselves were well paid for the work that they did. We would motion capture the fox, motion capture the horse. On Fridays, we would have tremendous fun betting, on the races with the best foxes and the horses from that week. I made a fortune once on Fin Freddy, one of the fastest riding foxes we ever discovered.
And these foxes would then, first of all, lead to the publication of your most famous study in Nature and another couple in Science, as well as your brief correspondence, once again, with Watson, who always seems to pop
Only
out.
because they begged, I was ready to publish everything in Nature, but apparently the science publishing world's very difficult at the moment. So Science did beg for a couple of my how does a fox ride a horse, and can they ride them better than humans? Will we see a fox jockey hybrid of Foxkey in the future? These issues all up for... I would remind all the major funders that further research is needed in this area.
Now, of course, the most famous incidence of kind of the product of your work was the publication of the sort of thesis behind this Nature paper in the Daily Mail, which was picked up by none other than Queen Elizabeth II. And for the next 3 years, she decided to attempt to race fox jockeys on top of her prized horse, Secretariat Slutsky, at the Grand National.
Well, of course, she wanted to do corgis. I mean, what originally attracted her Royal Highness to the work was a fox. Topologically speaking, is very similar to a corgi, and she was wondering whether she could combine two of her great loves, the others being her wonderful husband and a gin. And so she really wanted... It's one of the great disappointments, I think, for me, that we didn't win the Grand National with this approach. Each time the horses fell at the first. I think what we hadn't thought through was the effect of a large crowd of braying aristocrats on the average fox. This is a thing that foxes have really evolved to be extremely afraid of. And the effect of that wall of rah, I think was what led to all of our jockeys to bolt.
And, of course, understandably so. Now, we only have a short moment left, and so I would like to cover your final, absolute greatest discovery. The discovery of the interaction of neutrons on world leaders at the G7 summit 3 years ago.
I'd never really spent a lot of time in human physiology, but I thought it was ripe for those of us who knew a bit about particles to come on in. And I have to say, I'm proud of the work that we did. I know it's been extremely controversial. The discovery that pointing a ray of neutrons at somebody from 2 miles outside of the exclusion zone causes them to wet themselves immediately. It's been controversial that we found that and that we had to test it on so many different people at the G7. You would see us posting on our website. It's the Prime Minister of Germany next. Prime Minister of Germany immediately wets themselves, testing our theories. And we have had a lot of interest from the military, thinking of this as an anti-tank technology. Fire it at a tank enough times and the crew drown in their own urine. Tanks are terrible for the way they trap waste inside. But obviously we retain. It's one of the few situations in my career where I really have kept the data secret, no open science for me, so that we can keep this out of the hands of the military.
And well, do you think you'll maintain this closed approach to your science after your death? Because, of course, there's speculation that this technology could be used to facilitate a coming together of the right and the left, politically unified behind one thing: the incontinence of their leaders.
No, from the G7, we did find that it did have a tremendous unifying effect. However, what it unified was all world leaders in condemning and immediately banning this technology. So, really, if we're going to make it work, moon base will be required and a longer range on the neutron beam, somewhere that nobody can legislate us out of existence. So I think it's going to... I mean, really, these days I feel it's work for other scientists to take on. One of the things looking back on one's career is you start to think sometimes, maybe I've done enough. Maybe 3 Nobel Prizes is enough to keep me going. You'll remember I've won, obviously, medicine. I won chemistry and 1996 literature for just a particularly wonderful paper that I re-edited from a lost work of Richard and Feynman, Richard Feynman, yeah. And we turned it into a series of haiku about the nature of reality, and it was very, very lovely of the Nobel Prize Committee to award me the. I mean, Richard was dead by that point, so we couldn't share it.
Well, Professor Sir Roger Benson, FFS, that was your sciencey life. Professor Sir Roger Benson, of course, being the only scientist or person to have ever won 3 Nobel Prizes in 3 separate categories. And for those of you out there listening, if you want to keep up to date with all of Professor Sir Roger Benson's FFS's work, you can find him over at www.professorsirrogerbensonffs.co.uk. We've been Wow, What a Sciencey Life, and we'll see you next time. It's ta-ra from me. Bye-bye.
Nicely done.
A huge thank you to Sam for what was a lot of fun to improvise together, and I'd like to say a very special thank you to the world famous pianist Bodger Renson for that beautiful piano accompaniment, which was in no way just me randomly banging the white keys on a very cheap USB keyboard with no real idea of how to play the piano. I hope you enjoyed it thoroughly. For more from Professor Sir Roger Benson, FFS, FRS, AMS, ARSE, just get me drunk sometime and I'll do it. As ever, this episode has been written, recorded, put together, directed, and generally mucked about with by me, Steve Cross. Have a brilliant week.